There are two kinds of fathers in the world. The first says, "Come here," and the child comes. The second says, "Come here. Hey, come here, sweetie. Hey, buddy, pal, come here. Come here. Hey, I mean it. I'm counting. 1. Okay, I'm serious. All right, fine, I'll do it myself." Gee, I guess, which one wonders why their kids don't listen? You know, we live in an age when parents negotiate like hostage mediators.
I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. If you are looking for ransom, I can tell you I don't have money. But what I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills I've acquired over a very long career. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Bribe like corrupt politicians, and then act shocked when a 4-year-old looks them dead in the eye and says, "No." Here's the truth. Your kids are not confused. They are trained. Trained by repetition. Trained by empty threats. Trained to wait you out until you lose your mind or give up. Today, we're talking about obedience. Not the kind that just make fathers feel powerful, but the kind God commands. Obedience that produces joy, order, safety, and godly initiative. If you want children who obey God, you had better teach them how to obey you. So, join me as we build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarchy.
Rise up, for men of God have done with lesser.
Rise up, for men of God have done with lesser things. Give heart and mind, soul and strength and serve the King of Kings. Lift high the cross of Christ, tread where his feet have trod. As brothers of the Son of Man, rise up, O men of God.
Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. That was Colossians chapter 3, verses 20 through 21. I am Pastor Joseph Spurgeon, and you are listening to the Patriarchy Podcast, a ministry of Sovereign King Church. Welcome back to the podcast. We're ready for a brand new year, ready to hit the ground running and put out some very good episodes and content that help you as a father, as a husband, as a man, as a leader in your church and in the culture and society around us. This is the Patriarchy Podcast. We are here to help equip men to be men who serve God. We had a good year last year, refocusing on getting good interviews and good topics going. We're going to do the same thing this year. I've been blessed that some of the listeners have really appreciated the podcast and reached out and given me good feedback. We've even had some people make good donations, which is going to help us just improve all around. And so actually, speaking of donations, if you've been blessed by this podcast in the past and want to help see it continue, go to sovereignkingchurch.com, and there's a tab on there for giving, and there's a little drop down that says the Patriarchy Podcast, and you can give straight to the podcast. We don't do this to try to just make money. This is a ministry of Sovereign King Church, but the giving does help us to be able to buy new equipment, pay for the subscriptions of the different services that we use to produce the podcast, and just keeps things running and helps us to improve. So if you like what you're hearing and you want to see more, head on over there. Well, today's episode is going to come straight from a Sunday school lesson that I recently taught on obedience, authority, and parenting. This is what I call the principles for obedience training. And so it's not about necessarily control for control's sake. This is about training our children for joy, holiness, and life under God-given authority. Today we're going to talk about why obedience matters, what God says about authority, why parents are commanded to lead and it's not negotiable, And then we're going to walk through the biblical purposes of obedience training. And by obedience training, I mean training yourself to expect obedience from your children and training your children. So we'll look at the biblical purposes of it. We'll look at the standards God himself requires. And then we'll have some practical principles parents should embrace if they actually want children who obey right away, all the way, without grumbling. So if you're tired of children that don't obey, if you're tired of like barking commands, well, this episode's for you. So fathers, it's part of your responsibility. This has been even a good episode to share with your wife, for mothers, because this is part of their calling too. Like if you care about raising up the next generation to stand firm rather than collapsing into chaos, you need this conversation. So let's get to work and dive right in. Well, let's talk about the purpose of obedience training, which is simple: to help parents manage their child until the child acquires age-appropriate self-control to manage his or her own life. This is why God made you a parent, right? So you can manage the child, teach them, equip them, parent them until they don't need that management from outside. They get that from inside. And that is the purpose of why you need to train them for obedience. Now, we'll talk broader about the purpose, even broader here in just a moment, but let's talk about who obedience training involves. Well, the obvious, you're thinking, yeah, my kids don't obey, so I want them to be trained to obey. Help me out. It's like you send your dog to obedience school and they come back trained. And so the only person that need to be involved in that was the dog and the trainer. Well, it'd be nice if we can send our children off and they get a obedience training. Most time people send them off to public school and they're getting the opposite of that. But obedience training requires two parties. There are parents and there are children. And let me just say up front that about 90% of obedience training is parents disciplining themselves, being the kind of people that don't need outside discipline, outside training. They got to be disciplined themselves to expect obedience. Training for children to become obedient is actually pretty easy. Children will obey. The hard part, the very hard part, is ourselves. So there's parents and then there's children. Now, before we get into more principles and even the goals and things, let's talk about the biblical foundation. What's the biblical foundation? Well, I read to us already Colossians chapter 3, verses 20 through 21. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not exasperate your children, so they will not lose heart. So we have here this command from God to children that they are to obey their parents, but immediately is followed up with fathers. So here's your two parties in this obedience tree. There are children who obey and fathers who are warned not to exasperate their children. And so that teaches us a little bit something about obedience training, that its purposes is more than just simply control, though that's part of it, that it's aimed for the good of the children and the good of the parents. We see this further in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right, which is a perfect Bible verse for your children to memorize at age 2 and 3. Like, sit down with them. They should be able to memorize this, and you can help them when they need to obey. Hey, what does Ephesians 6:1 say? But, right, it's the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Ephesus, knowing that there are both parents there, there are children there, they're all considered part of the church, and telling them to obey their parents. And then he quotes from the Old Testament, from God's 10 commandments. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. There is here in this command a promise from God, which tells us part of the purpose, or at least a goal that we can look at God's commands. You know, when we look at God's commands, there's a way to see them as merely as arbitrary or as coming down from on high without purpose. And we must just obey regardless. And I think people have this mindset that at least non-believers do, that like these are all meant for shutting down our good, shutting down what would be kind and would be shutting down what we really want to do. And this shows us actually what God's commands. They come with these promises, and the promises really flow from the commands. Like if you obey your parents, things go well for you in the land. Like there's good that comes about. And God's commands for us then are not merely arbitrary. They have a good purpose. They actually do good for it. They're good. The law of God is good. And so you think of the 10 commandments, and then you can sum those up in the 2 great commandments: love God, love your neighbor. Right? They're good. And they're good because they have our good in mind and also God's glory. They bring God glory. They bring us joy. And whenever we are glorifying God, then there's just joy that flows to us that can't be shaken. You know, there's the old hymn, trust and obey, for there is no other way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey. And so Scripture teaches us that obedience, that children obeying their parents, is actually a good that leads to their joy. In fact, it leads to the joy of the all. Know what it means, like if you have children that don't obey, and children that don't listen, children that talk back, like there's not much joy. We've all been out at the grocery store and seen the mom who tells her child 3 or 4 times, and it's just finally she's aggravated. There's no joy to be had, and like God's glory is not being displayed. But when obedience happens, when these commands are obeyed, well, things go well. You get to live long in the land, and ultimately God's getting glory from that, and the joy abounds to us. You know, training our children to obey then is not merely about compliance, right? It's that compliance then is a means to an end, right? As parents, we have good ends to our commands. This is why God gives authority. Authority is given primarily for the benefit of the person under authority, right? God gave authority. The Scripture says God father to fatherhood. God gave fatherhood for the good of this world, for the good of families, good of wives, the good of children. And that authority, whether it's exercised in the civil realm, in the church, in the family, it is for good. And in particular, the good of those under that authority. Like God exercises his authority for the good of those under his authority. And so we as fathers do the same. Now, there is a benefit to the one with authority. Like as we exercise authority for the good of those under us, it does rebound to our good as well. And this is the biblical teaching, which is different than how pagans and how even unbelievers see authority. Like there's this big battle today between the sexes, right, over who will have authority. And it seems to be this zero-sum game, and that if the man is the leader, then that means the woman must suffer. And it's not a lose-lose. Like male headship should be a win-win for everybody. It should be that the God-given authority will benefit those under authority. And that means that those who have authority have to practice it that way. There is, again, a benefit for the one in authority, but only as he seeks the good of those he leads. Again, this is distinct from pagan view of power. In fact, Jesus in Matthew 20, 24 through 28 says, "And hearing this, the 10 became indignant with the 2 brothers." So there were 2 brothers, and they were fighting like, "Hey, we want a position of authority, Jesus. Like, I want to sit on your right and your left. We want to sit next to you and exercise the authority that you have when you have your kingdom." And they're fighting over it. Why are they fighting over it? Because they think, man, I'm in control now. If I'm going to get things the way I want, and I have the power. And it was about that. And when the other disciples hear about it, well, they start fighting too. And Jesus is going to put a stop to it. And he says, "But Jesus called them to himself and said, 'You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them.'" He's saying the Gentiles, this is how they do it. This is how the rulers of them do it. They lord over it. He even says they exercise authority over them. Well, does that mean he's against authority? No. It's the over them part. It's the lording over them. It is setting themselves up as if they are so great, and therefore everyone seeks to exist to serve them. They're lording over. Everybody's working to serve them, their desires, their ambitions. Jesus here is not abolishing authority. But what he is going to do, he's going to redefine its purpose. And he says, "It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." Jesus sets the example of authority and a leadership. Now, we've often heard that phrase, servant leadership, and that kind of comes from actually a corporate world, who I think may have tried to capture it from Scripture, but it comes from this corporate world. And the idea was to exercise authority without exercising authority. Was simply like, if you want a job done and you need other people to do it, you just start doing it and hopefully people will follow you. So that phrase is often used now to attack authority, and what I mean by that is giving commands. Anybody actually using authority. Servant leadership becomes a thing that husbands wear, like, well, you got authority, and your authority is to come home and ask your wife what she wants you to do. And so you can get your honey-do list from her, and now aren't you happy that you're in authority? This is not what is happening here. It's not what Jesus is doing. Why? Jesus didn't stop being an authority. In fact, he's still teaching and commanding his disciples here. Yet, when he came to use his authority to serve those under his care, which could mean getting out and doing the menial tasks. Jesus was not above that, and no authority should be. But it teaches us then about the aim of the authority, which is for the good of those under them, right? We are to exercise authority for the good of those under us. Bringing this around back to parents and obedience training. Well, when we talk about training our children to be obedient, that they are to obey, well, I think our modern mindset can almost make us shudder at that. Like, oh, is that being selfish? Well, it could be, if by obedience you merely want them to obey to make your life better so they can serve you, but not necessarily, because actually, if they obey, as Scripture says, and you are exercising authority for good, not exasperating them, teaching them to obey, which we're going to talk about the first time and all the way without grumbling or disputing, that is good, because you're serving for their good, you're leading for their good, and they're obeying for their good. And when that happens, it's win-win. I mean, this is the same way with husbands and wives. When a wife submits to her husband and her husband leads for the good, win-win. Now, this is the Patriarchy podcast, but I said earlier that it'd be good for moms to listen to this too, because men, you got to teach your wives. It is good for them that their children obey, and that they need to work on training their children to obey. Mothers, in my experience as a pastor, especially need to remember this when discipline feels hard or unpleasant. They have a hard time commanding the obedience of their children. And I think that's because, well, for many different reasons, but one is we've bought into this idea that, well, everybody has complete liberty to do whatever they want, and me being demanding obedience, well, that's bad. Now, everybody would say that, but I think there's a sense that even though they know that it's for good, they feel bad about it, and they feel bad when they have to demand it. But mom, recognize that God gave you authority for good, and you're to use it for good. And it's not good if your children don't obey. You need to prioritize obedience and obedience training, because you don't want to miss the big picture. Obedience is good not just for you as a mom or as a father, but it's good for the children. And so, big, large category, umbrella, why do we do obedience training? So that we can raise our children for what's good. All right, we're doing this for their good. Now, underneath this, there are 4 subcategories of why to do obedience training. And I'm going to just walk through those quickly. I won't spend a lot of time on those. But these are additional reasons, as if you need them, having heard what Scripture says. But this helps you know additional reasons why you need to prioritize obedience training in the very early years. Because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is assuming that you're going to start early. Obedience training is hard to start later, when the cement starts to dry up, like it starts to settle and become hard. Well, that's hard. You have to break that up to try to get obedience. So you need to start early. And you need to be set in your mind that this is important. It's not something that will just happen. You need to be diligent about it. And here's the reasons why. Again, it's for the good of the children. And then with that, we can put above that the glory of God, their joy. But bringing down even in more practical terms, it's good for their health and safety, right? Young children, starting with toddlers up through their early elementary years, are not old enough or wise enough to recognize the immediate consequence of all their actions, right? They don't understand the meaning of the word safe. And so when safety matters, you need a right response. You need obedience right now. You don't have the luxury for a time to beg or bribe your children in submission. Say, for example, children outside in the yard, and you notice the neighbor's pit bull has got loose and it's roaming the neighborhood, and it's heading towards your yard. Here's a test question for you. Will your children obey right now, all the way, if you say, hey, Charles, come here? Or will they run the opposite way? Will they throw a fit? Mom, do I have to? You said I could stay out here longer. How about I come back later? Give me 5 more minutes. You don't have a luxury of the whole back and forth debate. They must come. Or say they're a toddler and they're headed out towards the road and you say, stop. What will they do? Keep on running? Well, this is one of the purposes of obedience training. Your child's health and safety depend upon them, especially at young ages, obeying right away. Now, praise God that most of your life is health and safety issues aren't always happening every moment. They are important and they matter when they matter. And you need a child who obeys right away. Second reason is general parenting, what I call general parenting. And that is, as a parent, you have a whole lot of stuff that you want to teach your children about. You've got to teach them responsibilities like chores. You've got to teach them about their schoolwork that they need to do, their homework, or they need to learn about how to behave in church. I mean, you've got all kinds of things that you need to teach your children. And in order to be able to teach them anything, they need to be able to obey, right? You got to be able to start basically with, can they listen? Say, for example, you want to teach your child to read, a toddler. Can you say, hey, go over there and pick up that book and come sit on my lap, right? You got a 3-year-old, 4-year-old. They know what it means to go pick up a book. Will they obey? Will they run around? Responsibility like chores, and you say it's time to do that chore work. Will they do it? Or when you want to say, no running in church, right? You're teaching them and you're parenting them just in the general aspect of life, and being able to obey even something as basic as sitting, focusing, and concentrating. You need their ability to obey to happen then, right? Because if you can't keep little Johnny in his chair to do his schoolwork, how much learning can actually be achieved? So education itself is compromised when obedience is not realized. Now, from early years throughout early adolescence, the process of training takes time, and that means compliance is not always perfect or consistent, but getting obedience is so important just to the general task of parenting. And that means, they may not be consistent, you being consistent is key. And this is, we call it general areas. It's where most generic purposes of life. And yet, without obedience in this area, life is pretty miserable, isn't it? A third purpose that you need to teach obedience is for stewardship, right? We want to teach our children to obey the other commands of God, like to honor other people, stand up before the gray head, or to be respectful of other people's property. Thou shalt not steal or covet. I train our children to be respectful of their own property, their toys, their property of the other people in the family. God made man to take dominion over the earth, and you're training them for that. Well, your children need you to teach them that, but they also need to know and learn that they have to obey you in that as well. The fourth reason, and it's maybe the largest category, is what we simply call moral foundations. And a lot of this other stuff can be called that as well. Taking dominion certainly involves moral aspects, but your child's moral health is actually more important than their physical safety and their physical health. It's more important than their intellectual health. You're training so that their heart belongs to the Lord. And that requires a lot of work, and that requires them to learn obedience. At the toddler age, children often lack the capacity to think in moral realms. In fact, their moral life is all about the seagulls and finding Nemo. Mine, mine, mine. It's their controlling impulse, which overrides any sense of empathy necessary for otherness sensitivity. That is, they're born selfish, right? They don't have the ability to sympathize with others. And so everything's mine. And your work with your children is going to be really working to move them away from selfishness to thinking about others. And key to that is them being able to obey you, because if they can obey you, they've already stopped thinking necessarily about themselves. So summarizing all these purposes, again, we want to train our children to obey because it's good for their children. It's good for their health and well-being. It's good because it enables them to receive other parenting instruction. It's good because it helps them to learn stewardship. And it's good because it gives them a foundation for morality. By learning to be obedient to you, they are learning how to live as a godly person. In other words, they're learning obedience to God. They're learning to love God and love neighbor, which means they're learning the source of giving God glory and the source of joy. So you're teaching them what's good. Now, I've belabored that point because, as I've said, we all know this stuff is true, but sometimes we lose track of it and we lose sight of it, and we get lackadaisical. So I really want you to know how important it is to train your children to obey. Now, here's a question then. Okay, I know it's important to do obedience training. I know it's for their good. What is the standard for obedience training? So in my family, we have our children line up. We have 8 children. I was in the Army and military. So one of the tools I realized early on in our family life that would help me is what I call line up. It's formation time. Like in the military, you line up and you get in formation and you're at attention. Like you got 8 children, there's a lot of ways for there to be chaos and disorganization. And so one of the first things I teach them is line up, and they've line up by age. And every time we've added a new child into the lineup, they kind of figure it out pretty easily. That's the first thing we teach as far as obedience, is being able to stand here. But as we do that and we line up, I can give instructions and other things, but also I teach them little catechism questions. Like, for example, we have a family motto. What's the family motto? The Lord is King forever and ever, Psalm 10:16. Our family rule. And this family rule lays out the standard for obedience. And they will have to say, I will say, Spurgeon's, what is our family rule? And they will say, I will obey right away, all the way, without grumbling or disputing. And that right there, friends, is the obedience standard. This is what it means to obey parents. It's actually what it means for us to obey God. It's what obedience is. If one of these is missing, full obedience has not happened. This is the standard that God expects from us, right? So there's several components there, 4 of them, right? Right away. That is, there's not a delay. Again, going out to the pit bull, aiming towards the yard. Children, come in now. Right away matters. God expects obedience right away, not for us to dilly-dally, run around in circles, go play and hide in the corner, continue to do what we want to do. Like, no, when God speaks, we listen. In fact, the psalmist writes, Psalm 119:60, I hastened and did not delay to keep your commandments. Another aspect of obedience is to obey all the way. It means to do it all, to do what God says. Like halfway obedience is not obedience. Deuteronomy 26:16, you shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart, with all your soul. Or Psalm 119:4, you have commanded us to keep your precepts diligently. There's hard work there, diligence about obeying God. It means being able to obey every aspect of God's commands. You know, I think we think about legalism as somebody that's precise and careful to obey God. And that's not legalism. Legalism is thinking that you can earn God's favor, like you can earn your salvation, or by being careful and diligent to keep your own commands, to make things up, to replace God's commands. But when we love God, we want to obey all the way diligently. And your children need to learn that standard, right? If you tell them to go clean their bedroom and they come back and they didn't do it all, they just threw a toy off the floor, but they left the bed unmade, they did everything else, have they really obeyed? Now, the amazing thing about obedience, God's not merely concerned with the outward action. He's also concerned with the heart that does it. And that's why there's two more components. And one is to obey without grumbling. Philippians 2:14, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Now, we think of grumbling as this is a small matter, right? I'm just mad. Yeah, I'll go do it. And I stomp my feet and go do the thing that God told me to do, or to do the thing the parent. And like that seems small. If all you got to do is read through the book of Numbers and see how many times God judges his people severely for grumbling and complaining about his commands. Why? Because his commands are good. When they grumble and complain, it shows their heart's not there. They're not actually trusting God. And any outward action is merely compliance, but it's a compliance that will only last while there is that little bit of a moment. Like, we want our children to learn to obey in a way that they like to obey. They can find joy in obedience, because then that will carry on when you're not there, when there's not just a threat of discipline and correction over their head. This takes a lot of work to get this part of the standard right. And it starts with us not grumbling that God expects us to have this standard for our children. It also means we have to stop grumbling about our children. I think moms can get into the habit of you barking commands and then grumbling about them, about half obedience and all these things. Like grumbling, or another word, nagging, will not help. And then the last one is obey without disputing, right? Go back to that passage, Philippians 2:14, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Romans 9:20, but who are you, old man, who answers back to God? Right? We don't get to go back and forth with God and negotiate in bad faith with God. God is God. And you're the parents. And parents should not be negotiated with either. Right? There's no arguing and fighting back. But why do I have to do this or this? Johnny never has to do this. These are all disputes. Doesn't please God. So this is the standard for us with God. And if ultimately the reason we are training our children to obey is so they can be moral, they can love God and love neighbor, then they need to follow the same standard with us. That's a high standard, isn't it? You might be thinking, Pastor Joseph, you're asking quite a bit. Well, I'm not asking. It's God that commands us to do this. But I also know this is something that God tells us that we can accomplish. The book of Deuteronomy, God says his commands are not so high above us that they're out of reach. Yes, we have a sinful nature. And yes, on our own, all of his commands are out of reach. But by God's grace, God's power, they're not out of reach. They're close to us. We can obey, and so can our children. It's going to take work, and it's going to take, most importantly, faith in God as we do the work and trusting him. And then it's going to ultimately take his grace. It's going to take a lot of prayer. So now let's talk about the principles that parents must keep when we want to teach our children obedience. So we've explained the reason or purpose behind obedience training. I've explained the standard of obedience training. Now I want to talk about basically the principles for it. And again, I want to ask you, when I talk about obedience training, who do you think I have in mind? Because you probably think, well, it's the kids. But actually, it begins with you. You have to train yourself, and then you can train your children. And this is the hardest part about getting children who obey. It's actually having parents who expect obedience. Again, the hardest part is for you, father, to be trained. So basically what I want to do is I want to give you 4 basic principles for when it comes to instructing your children so that you don't exasperate them and so that you can train them to obey. And with each of these 4 principles, I'm going to give you the common mistakes that parents make when giving instructions. So these 4 principles are not going to make it perfect, but they will make this easier for you and your children when you are teaching obedience. And trust me, there are some really simple mistakes that parents make when giving instructions, when they are trying to teach obedience. These simple mistakes that at best discourage obedience, and worse, they actually encourage disobedience. So this is probably the best part, the heart of, well, how do I apply all this? This is the stuff that you came for when you listen to this podcast. So principle number 1, it's going to be a very simple principle. You ready? Say what you mean and mean what you say. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Children learn by the words we say. Instruction is a real part of the heart training process. But in the average home, most of our instructions come during moments of great frustration, right? We spend a whole lot of time instructing during time of conflict, when actually, if we learn to give instructions in times of peace, well, that helps as well. But also learning how to give instructions in such a way that your children will obey without you being exasperated or them. Wouldn't that be good? And quite frankly, it starts here. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Because wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be grand if you can give an instruction and the children immediately recognize and appreciated the wisdom behind your words? If they were like, oh, great, wise, and understanding, and reasonable, and most benevolent Father. I mean, who would oppose reasonable instructions? I don't know. Ask yourself. We have the most wise, the most benevolent. We have the most reasonable and godly God. And yet, why do we oppose it? Well, unfortunately, there are times when our children oppose even the most reasonable instructions. It could be that they prefer to continue doing what they were doing rather than comply. I mean, it can be a lot of different reasons. The question is, okay, what do you do? And this is where it comes down to this principle. Do you mean what you say and say what you mean? Or is it more like here? Hey, Ezra, come here. Ezra, come here. Ezra, 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 Ezra. I'm not going to tell you again. Ezra, how many times do I have to tell you? Now, Ezra, I mean it this time, Ezra. 5, 4, 3, 2. I mean it. Does it sound like I mean it? No, it don't. The father or the mother who first coaxes, then threatens, then bargains, then pretends to punish, then finally punishes a little, you're just making a bad situation worse. Why should a child ever respond the first time if he knows he's going to get 26 more chances, at the end of which there will be no penalty, but often, sadly, a reward? I heard a story once about somebody at an airplane terminal, and they watched repeated commands, and then threats, and then promises, and then threats again. And finally, the mom said, Blake, I'm going to get on this plane without you. And Blake, who was about 4 years old, told his mom, have a nice trip. Who's got the problem? Well, obviously not Blake. He's doing exactly what he wants. Why does Blake tune mom out and probably dad as well? Well, he discovered that in his little world, obedience is optional. That mom and dad don't mean what they say. Instead, here's their mistake: the repeating and threatening habit. Principle is mean what you say. Well, the mistake is then constantly repeating, then threatening. Here's a further mistake. It's when one day your son is going to look up at you and ask, Dad, what does it mean to be a man? What will you tell him? We live in a world that calls masculinity toxic, that treats boyhood like a disorder. But your son needs to know the truth, that God made him to be strong, to fight for what's right, to protect others, to build, to lead, to worship our King. That's why I wrote It's Good to Be a Boy, to give fathers a tool to teach their sons what it truly means to be a man. Dads, don't let the world define manhood for your son. Teach him, lead him, show him. It's Good to Be a Boy, available now on Amazon. Get your copy today. Mistake. It's when threatening doesn't work, you turn to a bribe. Once I had over at my house some parents and their children, and I watched this child be asked to do something over and over again. Finally, he was bribed with a piece of candy or some new toy. I can't remember what it was. And it was to do the smallest of a thing. I'm not talking like being bribed to do like some grand work. No, like just the normal, hey, can you hand me that cup? Or like, can you come here so we can get our shoes on and go? And it worked. You know, a bribe might work temporarily, but you need to understand what the Bible says about bribes. Bribes blind the discerning and pervert the words of the righteous. This is what Scripture says. So what's wrong with a bribe? Well, first of all, it's the establishment of a false or an improper motivation for obedience. It trains a child to obey for reward rather than out of obedience to God. You know, it is true that children can be rewarded for their obedience, but they should not be encouraged to be obedient in order to gain a reward. Another problem generated by this parent is that their children learn how to negotiate for their parents' acceptance of their behavior. Like they learn that they can negotiate for what their parents want. And let me tell you, when you do that, the roles are reversed. Additionally, you're training your child to become one of those like wusses that grow up and expect a reward for everything they do, even like the littlest of stuff. Like I've been at a job before, and like a guy was just goofing off, not doing a good job or whatever. And so when he got to get corrected, I remember him saying, well, but hey man, at least I get here. Like, what, you expect a reward for getting to your job? Being at work? It's not how it works. But this is what we train our children for, to get rewards for basic stuff that they should just be doing. Now, what happens after the threatening and the bribing and the repeating and the naming? What usually happens? Tell me what happens in your life. Well, I'll tell you. The parent who thinks he's being patient, maybe that would be his argument for why he's doing this. Well, that parent loses it. They get to the breaking point where their blood pressure is high, their face is red, their voice is shrieking. Like you're tempted to hit your child out of pure emotion. You're enraged. And then guess what? The child knows. I guess it's time for me to obey right now before things get too far out of hand, right? Isn't that how it happens? You've lost your cool, and now the child finally, well, okay, I guess I can do it now that I've got as much out of that as possible. I don't want it to go any further. In other words, we're teaching our children not to obey right away, but to delay as long as possible, which is contrary to the standards of God. So again, here's the principle. Say what you mean and mean what you say, which means never give an instruction unless you intend for it to be obeyed right away. Part of the problem is we give instructions that we don't really expect to be obeyed. And we'll talk in just a moment. We don't give them in a way that would be obeyed. But you don't give instructions unless you intend for them to be obeyed right away. Now, here's a bit of encouraging news for you, father. Your children will not have a problem with this principle. Quite frankly, it's usually mom who struggles with this and dad who struggles with it, because it actually calls you to not be lazy. It calls you to be consistent. Children will rise to whatever level of parental resolve is present. The question really is how much determination lies behind your instructions. Now, one other mistake under this principle is what I'm going to call the hostage negotiation. And that is negotiating away the command and conflict. Mom tells the child to put away his cars and comes to lunch. He says, Mom, I'm going to play with them after lunch. And Mom says, no, we're going to be going somewhere after lunch. But Mom, can I put them away after lunch? No, put them away now before lunch. Okay. So the son does what Mom asks, but brings 2 of the cars to the lunch table. So here comes the hostage negotiation. So what do you do, Mom? Well, I thought I told you to put away the cars. I know. I put them all, except I just wanted to bring 2 of them here with me. And finally, after more negotiation, Mom decides to let him keep one of the cars with him. Does this sound familiar to anyone? What's wrong with this? Is there anything morally wrong about having cars at the table? Was there any health or safety issues? Was this a matter of stewardship? What's wrong? Issue is that Mom negotiated to something less than her original instructions. When parents become characterized by continually accepting a negotiated compromise, they undermine their attempts to bring their child to first-time obedience. Right? In other words, if all your instructions are negotiable, which that's what you've just taught, well, then no instruction that you give is actually absolute. Which means that like there's not really obedience happening. It's just whatever I can negotiate. You know, when we negotiate the standard in the heat of the battle, like in the middle of the time there, when you're negotiating for that, there's no true surrender, only agreed upon suspension of conflict. And without a complete surrender, there will always be a member ready to wage war. In other words, you don't have peace here. You have taught your child he can negotiate away your commands, which means all your commands are negotiable, which means you don't mean what you say and say what you mean. Now, we will talk maybe in a different podcast about, as children age, giving them the ability to request additional information for the commands and things like that. But for now, you need to nail this into your noggin, mean what you say. Now, choose your battles well. But once you do, you got to hold the line. the line was wrongly drawn in the first place. Okay, we'll talk about fixing that, but you be the one to fix that, not be negotiated out. Like if you're continually giving in, then you're continually undermining any progress towards that biblical standard. Again, are there times to change in instruction? Sure, maybe. Yes. But for now, how about just practicing this? Say what you mean and mean what you say. Now, principle number 2 is very similar. You are the parent. Your child is the child. In other words, God gave you the authority, and he expects you to exercise it for their good, but he also expects you to exercise it. He expects you to be the father, the parent. The Westminster Larger Catechism on the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother, says that part of the duties of an authority are, by grave, wise, holy, and exemplary carriage, to procure glory to God, honor to themselves, and so to preserve the authority which God hath put upon them. Basically, it's saying by your conduct, by what you do, your speech, your actions, even your commands, you're going to procure glory to God from that. You're going to procure honor for yourselves. You will preserve the authority which God has put upon you. It's part of your duty, then, to preserve the authority God gave you. You are the parent and not the child. One of the mistakes, then, is seeking the child's approval for the instructions. Now, you would never maybe say that you're seeking your child's approval for your instructions. You wouldn't say it, but the way that we give instructions can either encourage obedience or decrease it. And in particular, just one word can make a difference. And the word is said like a question, and the word is okay. And it sounds like this. Hey, Hezekiah, it's time to put your game away and get ready for bed, okay? But let's tidy up the playroom before Dad gets home, okay? Now, as a parent, do you need to add okay to the end of your instructions? No, you don't. You don't actually need your child's permission. Now, I understand why you do this. I've struggled by doing this myself, because by adding okay to my instructions, what I'm actually trying to say is, do you understand me? But you need to put yourself in the mind of a child. It's actually better to just say, do you understand me? Or do you hear me? Than okay. Okay sounds like a question. It sounds like you're saying, hey, are they okay with this? And that okay undermines your authority and redefines the meaning of obedience in the mind of the child. Another way you can do this is to give instruction disguised as an option when you don't really mean to give it an option. Hey, sweetie, do you want to take a nap? Are you ready to pick up your toys? Again, sounds like we're being polite and kind. But put yourself in the mind of your child. What did they just hear? Well, they just heard a question, which means they have an option. And ask yourself this: what child is going to say, yes, yeah, I'd like to pack up my toys and go take a nap now? Maybe if they're really tired, but good parents know that nap times are not always optional. Children need them. Right? There are times when you may want to give an option, but remember, you are the parent. If you want them to take a nap, say it's time for nap time. Or, all right, you need to pick up your toys. Do you hear me? Do you understand what I'm saying? Hey, what are you going to do now? Right? Don't give options when there are none. This goes back to saying what you mean, and it's recognizing you're the parent and they're the child. Like they are to obey. You don't need their permission to give them commands. Now, getting both of those right goes a long ways. But you can do all that, and this next one, not doing it, will really hurt you. And that's principle 3, which is give instruction only when you have your child's attention. Like this might be the most important. You walk into the room where the kids are playing and say, hey, I need someone to help clean up the church. Can someone help clean up the kitchen? Can someone help clean up the kitchen? Well, I don't know who someone is. Most likely that person is not going to help clean up the kitchen. Or, hey, I hope you kids are doing your chores. Well, forgive my crudeness, but my mother used to say this: you can hope in one hand and poop in the other and see which one gets fuller. Right? I hope you kids are doing your chores. Well, you know which hand will get bigger, get filled up quicker. In other words, you might as well just whispered your commands. You're just shouting into the wind. First of all, you didn't mean what you said. Secondly, you didn't have anyone's attention. Mothers get into the habit of this often. They'll just run around barking orders to children, and they're talking over the TV. They're giving generic instructions to no one specifically, talking from the other room. Let me tell you, they don't work. They're unhelpful at best, especially for little ones, At worst, they exasperate yourself, and then they exasperate the children because then you finally get angry and want to discipline when you didn't have anybody's attention. So the first part of the battle here is simply to get their attention, get eye contact. In fact, require it. Say, hey, look at daddy. Look at mom. Again, I do that line up. We have everybody line up when I want to give instructions to all of them, and then I give them specific instructions, right? Make it a standard practice to get your child to look you in the eyes when you're speaking. That's good not just for this, but that's good for helping them to have good social skills, to be able to shake hands and look somebody in the eye. It helps them to focus. It helps children to process instruction. Processing half is the battle to getting your child to follow your instructions. In fact, I would argue that many times parents are frustrated at disobedience because, quite frankly, they never had their children's attention when they gave the instruction. They never made sure the child knew what the instruction was and understood it completely, and so it doesn't get carried out. A child who's allowed to look around the room rather than at mom or dad will struggle with compliance because actually he's not obeying the very first step. Pay attention when the instructions are given. You got to start there, teaching them to pay attention. Basically, if they're a young child, when they're looking around, you just kind of take their chin and you say, hey, here, look at dad. And then they'll look at you. Sometimes they'll open their eyes wide. Say, good. And you may have to do it a couple times, but you're getting their attention. Another part of this is their verbal response. Again, parents experience more frustration at times of instruction than in any other single activity, probably in parenting. And it's because at the point of instruction, that's when the child decides to obey or disobey. Again, disobedience brings conflict. And one of the ways to make sure that children have the moral movement in their own hearts for obey is what we're going to get a verbal response to your instruction. This is a practical tool. It's going to help minimize a parent's frustration and have the most impact on children's willingness and ability to comply the first time. So basically, what you do, get your child's attention, focus here, look here, and now there's a simple two-step process, right? The first step belongs to you, and the second step's them. The first, hey, you get their child's name. Hey, Charles. And then you pause, and you're waiting for your son or daughter to come and say, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, if you're the mom, right? You're waiting for them to respond to that, which means you got to teach them this. So you're going to have to sit down for a while and say, hey, when daddy says, hey, Charles, your answer is going to be, yes, sir. And there may be a whole lot of practice, a lot of like having fun with it. You can actually make games out of this. Like when we teach that lining up thing, like I'll say line up, but then I expect them to come get in their spots. And if it's slow or whatever, I'll say, hey, too slow, go in the other room. And they'll go in the other room. And then I'll say, line up, and then they'll come faster. And I'll just kind of make fun with it, back and forth. And then we'll say, hey, teaching them, yes, sir. Hey, Charles, I didn't hear you. You're supposed to say, yes, sir. Let's try it again. Try it again. Try it again. Try it again. You keep doing it. When they're young, they'll get it. They'll get, yes, sir. That's music to my ears, actually, as a father to hear, yes, sir. But the reason you're going to say Charles and you're going to pause and you hear the yes, sir, is because you're about to separate the authority component of your instructions from the actual instructions. So calling your child and waiting for a response, especially in these younger years, is to really help your child to know that instruction's coming. So once you have your child's attention, which you know you have when they said yes, sir, and they're looking at you, you get to say the instruction. And then you get to have them say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, again. In fact, one of the things I ask them is, hey, Rocky, I would like you to go clean your bedroom. Yes, sir. Hey, Rocky, what are you going to do? I'm going to go clean my bedroom. Like doing that, you don't have to say right or okay. You don't have to say, repeat yourself a million times. In fact, when they say yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, or yes, mom, yes, dad, this is them in some small way committing themselves to obedience, which I think that works on their heart some. So think of your initial instruction as drawing a line in the sand. Rocky, I want you to pick up your crowns right now. If you repeat the instruction, the second line is drawn in the sand and you're making a small retreat. Did you hear me? Pick up your crowns. Well, now you're getting back to that repeating pattern. Soon you're repeating again and again and again. You're back to that other thing. In other words, you go when you say, hey, Rocky, and they say, yes, sir. And then your child, you say, I want you to pick up your crowns right now. And then they say, sir, what are you going to do? I'll pick up my crayons. Let me tell you, like an amazing thing happens. You had one line in the sand, and then there is a compelling force of compliance when a child hears himself verbally agree to your instruction. It kind of elicits a internal compulsion to comply and help prevents disobedience from taking place. Furthermore, you have a way to be able to discipline them. Hey, you told me you were going to do this. That was your own words. Now, sometimes you have to ask them to get specific. Right? Hey, I want you to go to your bedroom and clean up. Well, I don't know about you. I've told kids to do that. And by clean up, they go in there, they move through things around and come back out. Older children should know better because you've taught them well. But younger children, well, they need you to be more specific so they can be specific. Hey, Rocky, I want you to go to your bedroom. I want you to pick up the clothes on the floor, and I want you to put them in the laundry basket. Yes, sir, I'll put the clothes in the laundry basket. And in fact, not even, yes, sir, I'll pick up clothes. You want them to be specific. They might say, hey, yes, sir. Yes, sir, what? I will pick up the clothes, okay, and put them in the laundry basket. So getting their attention, being specific in the instruction, and getting them to repeat back will go a long, long ways. It'll keep you from being frustrated. Now, this requires you hard work, right? This requires some time commitment. You can't just walk through a room and bark orders on the way through. Problem is, yeah, it requires a little bit more time for you to say that. But how much time are you actually saving when you walk by the room 3 or 4 times and nothing happens? And finally you get frustrated and you end up doing it yourself, or you get frustrated and nobody did it, and so you berate everybody, and now everybody's frustrated. When simply you could have went into the room and said, excuse me, hey, everybody, look here. I need you to go do this. Yes, sir, I'll go do this. And that leads us to the 4th principle, and which I'm going to call give a heads up. So we've talked about how of giving the instruction. Now we want to talk about the timing of instruction, because that matters too. You don't want to exasperate your children. And parenting instruction that interrupts or terminates an activity, well, that can be exasperating. And one of the ways to keep it from being exasperating is by just giving them the courtesy of a warning. Again, who of us has not been caught up in an activity and a project, and then someone wants you to leave that and do something else, and they do it without a warning? Doesn't that frustrate you? It's like, oh, I'm in the middle of watching something here. Even the kids bother you. You're watching a movie and now they bother you and you're frustrated. And it's only good parenting skills. It's only kind and courteous to sometimes give a warning. So the 5-minute warning is very helpful. Now, you know your little children, they don't know what 5 minutes means, but they do know that I'm about to get some instruction. Things are about to end. So they're playing a game on the floor in the living room, and you need them to put that up and clean up. And it's now lunchtime. Hey, children, you got about 5 more minutes left, and then we're going to clean up, and we're going to go eat lunch. And again, you want to hear the yes, sir. Again, you don't want to just shout this into the ether, but it's good to get their feedback to that so they hear it. A warning that they don't hear is not really a warning. So children, yes, you got 5 minutes. All right, thank you, Dad. Again, that will shore up your authority here. So let's bring this in for a conclusion. We've talked about the purpose of obedience training. We talked about the standard, obey right away, all the way, without grumbling or disputing. And we talked about the 4 principles. And let me just end by saying that when our children disobey, they are sinning. And when you, as a parent, reinforce disobedience, you are enabling sin, which is sin itself. You've been given authority for good, which means you need to exercise your authority for good, but it means you need to train your children to obey. Judicial parenting does not allow parents to reward sin by doing nothing about it. If your children are disobedient, well, then you need to correct it. But for now, let me just end by encouraging you to begin putting this stuff into practice. Begin teaching obedience to your children. I'm sure most of you have already been doing this. So this is just a renewed call to do what you've been doing. But as we get this renewed call, let it come back to us and be reminded that actually, okay, I want children to obey. I need to obey God. What part of the standard do I fail at? Am I a delay obedience when God has something for me? Am I a half do it kind of guy? Just do it to get it done? Am I a grumbler and complaining about it? I do it, but grumble and complain. Or I dispute, try to argue my way out of it. We can be very good at that, right? Like twisting scriptures. There come all kinds of ways for why we don't have to obey. Get the standard right. Work on it in your life. Pray for God's grace to work on it, and then teach your children the standard. Disobedient children is not really a mystery. Sadly, children are often led into insubordination by us, their loving caregivers. Right? If our instructions have no resolve behind them, our children will take advantage of our parental uncertainty and assert their own unguided will. So, brothers, let me encourage you. God's given you his grace and mercy for this work. He's given you his word to teach you about his work. If you need more help putting these things in practice, ask some questions. Well, you feel free to reach out to me. But I would encourage you to reach out to your pastor, other older, wise men and women in your congregation. There are some good programs that you can look at about parenting and growing in that as well. Some of my material today came from a program called Growing Kids God's Way. Other material that's been helpful has been Doug Wilson on Why Children Matter. He has, in fact, several good parenting books. But there are resources out there. I just want you to know you're not alone, and that the work that you do here is so vital. You know, we can talk about Christian nations. We can talk about recovering a lot of stuff. But if we want real faithfulness and we want to see these things come out, it's going to take multi-generational effort. Some of the greatest work that you men will do is training your children so that they can train the next generation and train the next generation. It's vital. Well, brothers, if this podcast has been helpful to you, this episode, please like and share it. Share it with someone you think that might be helpful. Maybe your wife would be helped by it. If you want to support the podcast, again, go to sovereignkingchurch.com, go over to giving, and you can give there. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But brothers, until next time, build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarchy.